What northern culture really looked like in 1970s, Britain was nothing like the stereotype you've been sold. Picture this. While London swung through the 60s and stumbled into punk, the North was creating something far more revolutionary. A cultural identity so fierce it still echoes through every all right love heard in Manchester today. You think you know about flat caps and whippets? However, the real North of the 70s was hosting all-night dance marathons where teenagers invented modern club culture, where working men's clubs had better entertainment than West End theatres, and where the supposed grim up north narrative was being actively manufactured by southern media, while northerners were having the time of their bloody lives. Now, before we dive into the meat and gravy of northern culture, we need to address the elephant in the room. Or should I say, the ferret down the trousers. Where exactly does the North begin? This question has started more arguments in British pubs than whether it's a barm, bap or bread cake. The conventional wisdom says it's anything north of Watford Gap services on the M1, but that's just lazy southern thinking. Ask a Yorkshireman and they'll tell you it starts at the River Trent. Ask someone from Newcastle and they'll insist Manchester is basically the Midlands with delusions of grandeur. The BBC historically drew the line at Crewe for administrative purposes, which is why Granada Television, based in Manchester, became the unofficial voice of the North. Here's something that'll blow your mind though. In the 1970s, the government actually had different subsidies and support schemes that kicked in at different latitudes. The development areas started roughly at Stoke-on-Trent, but the special development areas where the real northern hardship money went didn't start until you hit Merseyside and Tyneside. So technically, the government thought there were at least two norths. The sort of north and the proper north. The truth is, being northern in the 70s wasn't really about geography at all. It was about attitude. It was about whether you'd queue for 3 hours to see Wigan Casino's all-nighters, whether you knew that tripe wasn't just something politicians talked, and whether you understood that "I'll see thee" was both a goodbye and a threat depending on the tone. Right then, if you're enjoying this trip down the ginnel of memory lane, do us a favour and hit that subscribe button, because we're about to reveal something about Northern Soul that even your dad who claims he was there probably doesn't know. Speaking of Wigan Casino, let's talk about the phenomenon that was Northern Soul, and here's where things get properly interesting. While the rest of Britain was listening to prog rock and growing their hair, thousands of northern teenagers were creating the most athletic, acrobatic dance culture Britain has ever seen. But here's the controversial bit. Northern Soul was essentially built on commercial failure. These were American soul records that had flopped in the States. Songs that couldn't make it in Detroit or Philadelphia became anthems in Wigan, Blackpool and Stoke. Frank Wilson's "Do I Love You, Indeed I Do," originally pressed by Motown and then withdrawn, became the Holy Grail. Only a handful of copies survived, and by the late 70s it was changing hands for £500. That's about £3,000 in today's money for a 7-inch piece of vinyl. In 2009, one sold for £25,000. The all-nighters at Wigan Casino ran from midnight Saturday to 8 a.m, Sunday starting in 1973. And let me tell you something the documentaries gloss over. The reason everyone could dance for 8 hours straight wasn't just northern stamina. The pharmaceutical enhancement of choice was amphetamines, particularly dexedrine and drinamyl. The dancers would sew special pockets into their vests specifically for their supplies. It was an open secret, treated with collective blindness by authorities who preferred kids dancing to alternative activities. The fashion was extraordinary. While London was doing safety pins and torn jeans, Northern Soul dancers wore high-waisted Oxford bags that could cost a week's wages, vests from specific American suppliers, and bowling shirts that had to be sourced from the States. The wide trousers weren't just fashion. You try doing a backdrop in drainpipes. Now let's move from the casino to another northern institution, the Working Men's Club. If you've never been to one, imagine Las Vegas had a baby with your nan's front room, and that baby was raised on Federation Bitter. These weren't just pubs with committees, they were entertainment complexes that would put modern venues to shame. The circuit attracted the biggest names in entertainment. Tom Jones, Shirley Bassey and Roy Orbison all played these venues, particularly in their early careers, and sometimes returning even after fame. The money could be exceptional. A good comic could earn more in a week touring northern clubs than from a television series. Batley Variety Club in Yorkshire was the jewel in the crown. With a capacity of over 1,500, it hosted everyone from Louis Armstrong to Eartha Kitt. The club had its own orchestra pit, revolving stage, and more sequins per square foot than the London Palladium. This wasn't pie and peas entertainment, this was Vegas-level showbiz happening in a former textile town. The committees that ran these clubs wielded extraordinary power. They controlled who performed, who drank, and who got barred. The Federation of Working Men's Clubs was like a northern parliament, with more political intrigue than Westminster. Getting barred from your local club meant social exile. Your wife would still go, but you'd be stuck at home watching Crossroads. The 70s saw the North's industrial base contracting rapidly, but the culture built on that foundation was transforming, not dying. The Ashington Group, the famous Pitman painters, had been meeting since 1934, and by the 70s their work was exhibited internationally. These were miners who'd create art between shifts. Their paintings now worth more than they'd earn in a lifetime underground. The 1972 and 1974 miners' strikes weren't just about wages, they were about entire communities watching their identity being dismantled. When Ted Heath called the February 1974 election asking, "Who governs Britain?" he lost his majority, effectively giving the miners their answer. The 3-day week, power cuts and candlelit dinners became part of national folklore, but in mining communities it was about survival, not romance. The cooling towers and pithead winding gear that dominated skylines weren't just industrial architecture, they were cultural monuments. When Agecroft Colliery's towers were demolished in 1994, people wept. These structures had become as much a part of identity as Yorkshire pudding or Lancashire hot pot. What emerged from industrial decline was remarkable adaptation. The precision required in mill work translated into the intricate footwork of northern soul. The shift patterns that had governed industrial life created the template for all-night entertainment culture that would later birth Acid House in Manchester's warehouses. Alright, we're halfway through, and if you're not subscribed yet, you're missing out on next week's video where we explore how Manchester basically invented modern music. No exaggeration, from Northern Soul to punk to Acid House, it all started in rainy Manchester. The flat cap and whippet image is like describing all of 70s fashion through one narrow lens. The reality was far more diverse and innovative. Northern women in the 70s were style pioneers, mixing high street with homemade, creating looks that modern vintage enthusiasts pay fortunes to recreate. The northern mod and suede head scenes were distinct from their southern counterparts, smarter with different musical tastes and without the media notoriety. A proper northern soul boys outfit could cost a month's wages, imported American stay-pressed trousers, Fred Perry or Ben Sherman shirts when they were still made in England, and brogues or bowling shoes polished to perfection. About those whippets, yes, they were popular, but primarily for racing and gambling, not as poverty accessories. Whippet racing was serious business with breeding programs, training regimens, and betting syndicates. A champion racing whippet could be worth more than a car. The famous Tynebridge Trophy attracted thousands of spectators and serious gambling money. The real fashion revolution was happening in Manchester's underground gay scene and the Northern Soul clubs, where gender boundaries in clothing were being challenged years before Boy George made it mainstream. Lads wearing vests and hot pants to dance in, girls in men's bowling shirts. This was radical stuff disguised as dance wear. Northern dialect in the 70s faced systematic suppression. The BBC's policy against regional accents in serious broadcasting meant that to work in national media, Northerners had to undergo elocution lessons. Yet this linguistic apartheid only strengthened regional identity. Every area had distinct vocabulary. Hull's isolation created unique words like 10-foot for alleyway and larkin for messing about. Newcastle's Geordie included Scandinavian-influenced words that existed nowhere else in England. Manchester's nasal twang and unique rhyming slang would later influence Manchester and British hip-hop. The grammar differences weren't mistakes but historical survivals. The use of were for all persons, I were, you were, he were, came from Old Norse influence. Thee and thou weren't quaint but practical. They distinguished singular from plural in ways Standard English had lost. This linguistic diversity was weaponized. Code switching, the ability to dial accent up or down depending on audience, became an art form. Northerners would deliberately thicken their accents when dealing with Southern authority figures, using incomprehension as resistance. Northern cuisine in the 70s was undergoing a quiet revolution while maintaining fierce traditions. The pie shops weren't just takeaways but institutions with secret recipes and loyal followings. Pools in Wigan, established in 1929, had queues every Saturday morning for their butter pies, a delicate balance of potato, onion and butter that required precise technique. Black pudding production was industrial art. Berry's market stalls sold varieties that would later inspire Michelin-starred chefs. The Berry Black Pudding Company's recipe was so guarded that only 2 people knew it completely. This wasn't poverty food, but craftsmanship. The Indian restaurants of Bradford and Manchester were creating British Indian fusion before anyone coined the term. The Balti, despite its Birmingham associations, was being developed simultaneously in several northern cities. Chip shop curry sauce, that luminous yellow concoction, was invented in the north, combining Chinese restaurant leftovers with chip shop pragmatism. Fish and chips reached high art status. Harry Ramsden's in Guiseley wasn't just a chippy but a destination, seating 250 people and serving fish that had been swimming 24 hours earlier. The debate over scraps versus bits could divide families. Every town had hierarchies. Which shop used beef dripping, which had the best mushy peas recipe, which would give you extra on a Wednesday. Markets were theatre, social services, and shopping combined. Berry Market was Europe's largest, with over 600 stalls creating a covered town within a town. Market traders were performers whose patter was passed down through generations like folk songs. The characters were legendary. Cheap Jack would auction goods with rapid-fire commentary that predated rap battles. The fruit and veg men would juggle oranges while calculating prices in their heads faster than tills. The fabric sellers could estimate yardage by eye and cut straight lines freehand. Pet stalls sold everything from budgies to ferrets, with occasional exotic animals appearing mysteriously. The famous Berry Black Pudding stalls had secret recipes and customer loyalty spanning generations. Market day social hierarchies were complex. Where you stood in queue, who you chatted with, which stalls you frequented, all carried social meaning. These markets were also underground economies. Fallen off the back of a lorry was less crime and more wealth redistribution. Everyone knew which stalls sold seconds from local factories, providing designer goods to working-class families at prices they could afford. Television's portrayal of the North in the 70s was complicated and often contradictory. Coronation Street, produced by Granada Television in Manchester from its 1960 inception, was simultaneously authentic and artificial, using northern actors but often writing storylines that reinforced stereotypes for national consumption. Granada Television itself was revolutionary. As the franchise holder for the Northwest, it produced groundbreaking programming. World in Action's investigative journalism was fearless, exposing everything from corrupt politicians to dangerous working conditions. When they revealed asbestos poisoning at Turner and Newell factories, they faced legal threats but continued reporting. The comedy emerging from the North was subversive but often couldn't get past London commissioners. Les Dawson's surreal wordplay, Victoria Wood's observational genius, and Peter Kay's character studies all developed in northern clubs where immediate audience feedback shaped material. The Phoenix Nights Club that Kay later immortalised was based on real venues where entertainment standards often exceeded television variety shows. The biggest tragedy was how much northern culture went unrecorded. While BBC documented everything in London, extraordinary performances in northern clubs vanished into memory. Entire comedy careers, musical movements and cultural phenomena existed without any archival footage. Here's what really rankles. The North in the 70s was creating the future while being portrayed as the past. The warehouse parties that would become acid house, the independent record labels that would revolutionise music distribution, the comedy that would reshape British humour, all germinated in supposedly grim northern towns. The miners and factory workers weren't just industrial muscle, but organised intellectuals. The Workers' Educational Association ran philosophy courses in mining villages. The cooperative movement maintained libraries and lecture halls. Union meetings discussed Gramsci alongside wage negotiations. This was working-class intellectualism that threatened established power structures. The supposed north-south divide was carefully maintained because it served political purposes. Keep regions suspicious of each other and they won't unite against common exploitation. The deindustrialization of the North wasn't economic inevitability, but political choice, destroying communities that had developed strong collective identities. The resistance took many forms. The Shrewsbury 24 building workers, imprisoned for picketing, became political causes célèbres. The Upper Clyde shipbuilders' work-in provided a model for industrial action that preserved jobs rather than just withdrawing labour. These weren't just strikes, but philosophical challenges to capitalism itself. The northern culture of the 70s created templates still used today. Those Wigan Casino all-nighters established DJ culture, remix culture, and the devotion to obscure records that defines modern club culture. The Hacienda and Manchester followed paths Northern Soul created. The community solidarity forged in 70s industrial action manifested in campaigns for justice. Hillsborough, Orgreave, the managed decline of Liverpool. The suspicion of London media that developed then remains sharp today, evidenced in how differently regional and national media cover northern stories. Modern northern pride isn't nostalgia, but inheritance. Grime artists sampling northern soul, Manchester's continued musical innovation, Liverpool's cultural renaissance, Newcastle's transformation into a digital hub. These build on foundations laid when the North refused to accept its prescribed decline. The linguistic confidence developed then flowers now in northern comedy dominating television, northern writers winning prestigious prizes, and northern accents no longer being career barriers. Though battles remain, the war for cultural legitimacy was essentially won in the 70s. So what did northern culture really look like in 1970s Britain? It looked like innovation disguised as tradition, revolution dressed in working clothes, and futures being invented in supposedly dying towns. It was simultaneously preserving heritage and creating entirely new cultural forms. The North of the 70s wasn't grim, it was defiant. It wasn't dying, it was transforming. While London was importing culture, the North was manufacturing it in terraced houses and community centres, documenting it in memory rather than media, and passing it down through practice rather than publication. The tragedy isn't that this culture declined, but that it was so poorly documented. While anthropologists studied distant cultures, the most interesting cultural laboratory in Britain operated without observation, recorded only in the memories of participants and the occasional grainy photograph. Right then, if you've made it this far, you're proper northern at heart, even if you're watching this from Surrey. Hit that subscribe button harder than a flying picket hitting a scab wagon. Ring that notification bell like it's last orders at the Working Men's Club, and I'll see you next week. Remember, it's not grim up north, it never was. And anyone who says different is probably trying to keep property prices down. Ta-ra!